All right, my name is Patrick Brown. I'm a PhD climate scientist. I am the co-director of the Energy and Climate team at the Breakthrough Institute. I'm also an adjunct faculty member in the Energy Policy and Climate program at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm a visiting research professor in the Wildfire Interdisciplinary Research Center at San Jose State University. And the title of this talk is The Social Feedback Loop That Puts Blinders on Climate Science. And this is a follow-up to an essay I wrote in the Free Press called I Left Out the Full Truth to get my climate change paper published. I just got published in Nature because I stuck to a narrative I knew the editors would like. That's not the way science should work. And this caused quite the hullabaloo, as you can see by some of this coverage over here by national media. A lot of the coverage, this coverage is relatively neutral. Some of the coverage was quite negative, and we got some headlines like this: Patrick Brown's stunt takes climate change denial to a new plateau. So I do want to take a second at the very beginning, at the very outset here, to clarify that I am not a climate change denier. I am a PhD climate scientist who studies climate change and its impacts. And I would just say that there is a scientific consensus that humans are causing global warming. And that has been articulated in the scientific literature. A lot of times you hear the statistic 97% consensus, and that applies to this statement that humans are causing recent global warming. There is also a scientific consensus on the physical fact that CO2 emissions must be reduced to net zero to halt warming. And so I don't like the phrase climate change denier, but I do think that it is more or less legitimate to say that dismissal of either one of these two scientific facts can be legitimately called climate change denial. And that is not anything close to what I am doing in my essay or in this talk. So there is not a scientific consensus on the optimal speed for decarbonizing the global economy, which is what is entailed by a temperature target like a 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 target. So we can see that here in emissions. This is historical emissions, and this is what emissions of CO2 would have to be in order to be consistent with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So a lot of times you'll hear the shorthand net zero by 2050. So questioning whether or not limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 is optimal is not climate change denial. So back to the title of my talk, the social feedback loop that puts blinders on climate science. I'm drawing a parallel here that in climate science, there are self-reinforcing feedbacks in the physical system that garner a lot of attention. But less appreciated feedback loops also exist on the social side of things in the generation of climate science knowledge itself. And I think of these social feedback loops as fitting into this system, which is basically the journey from raw data to knowledge that is used by the public and used by decision makers. So one beginning selection effect here that I won't go into in this talk is just who decides to become a researcher in a given field in the first place. That's a self-selected group. But then among the people that become researchers in a field, there's a myriad of research questions that you might choose to ask, and certain questions get asked more than others. Then once those research questions are asked, there are various ways to answer those questions, so different methodologies, data sets, models, locations, timeframes, and certain of those get used more than others. Then there's all sorts of decisions made by researchers about the focus of the title of research papers and what to put in the abstract. And so only some of those are emphasized more than others. And then there's the kind of media side of things. There's the focus of university press releases, and then what the media focuses on. And so this journey from raw data to decision maker knowledge is affected by conscious and unconscious preferences of the people involved in this chain, and in particular researchers in this part of it, as well as career and social incentives facing researchers. And so I think there are positive feedback loops that affect this journey. And so in my essay in the Free Press, I was focused in particular on these three columns. So decisions made about the research question to ask, how specifically to go about answering that research question, and then the focus and title of the research paper and the abstract. In particular, I was talking about publishing in what get called high impact journals. So some of the main points here that I was trying to make are just that there are substantial incentives to publish in high impact journals. And essentially the highest return on investment for a researcher to try to publish in these high impact journals is to frame research to at least implicitly support what has become the mainstream narrative. And I think one way of summarizing the mainstream narrative is to essentially just say support of the Paris Agreement. So support of that most stringent emissions reduction pathway that we saw. Part of that narrative would just be that the costs of limiting global warming to 1.5 C are far smaller than the benefits. And so we should do that. And so I talked about how my paper in Nature was framed in a way to be not explicitly, but implicitly in support of this. So my paper was called Climate Warming Increases Extreme Daily Wildfire Growth Risk in California. And I talked about how wildfires, it's well known that wildfires are the result of many causal factors, but I chose specifically to focus on the climate change angle. So this is a diagram of all of the interactions and causal factors that affect wildfires. And my paper focused on this pathway, the fossil fuel emissions, global climate system, and then its impact on weather and how that then influences wildfires. And I chose not to bring in and vary these other important causal factors. So fire suppression, wildland-urban interface expansion, fuel alteration, changes in ignitions. I chose not to let those things vary or let those things be part of the study because I thought it would muddy the waters and make it so that the kind of clean, compelling story of climate change increases extreme daily wildfire growth risk would be diluted. And all these assumptions are laid out in a completely forthright way in the paper itself. So the paper is clear that it's only looking at one small aspect of the problem. And these framing decisions are not necessarily distorting, and a complete picture could emerge if research that looks at other aspects of the issue are equally represented in the highest profile literature. But the distortion emerges in aggregate when social and career incentives cause the most high profile research to coalesce around similar framing decisions. So in the remainder of my talk, I'm going to be expanding on a number of the issues I raised in the Free Press essay. So there's about 6 of them. So one is the desirability of high impact publications. 2 is, given that they are desirable, what strategies will researchers take to maximize their chance of publication. 3, I'm going to talk a little bit about the mainstream narrative of the Paris Agreement being kind of optimal and how that has interacted with the science historically. I'm going to be talking about what I think is essentially left out from the mainstream scientific literature canon, and a little bit more on the social feedback loop, some of the social condemnation that I got for publishing my essay, and then how to make more room for the full picture for a scientific literature that is more representative of the full reality. So first, just the desirability of high-impact publications. So I think it's important for people to know that peer-reviewed publications are the most important accomplishments on a researcher's CV, and it's how we are judged. It's our main figures of merit, essentially. So you do want your papers to be seen by other people and to get attention. And it turns out that these high-impact journals are called high-impact because they garner a lot of attention. So Carbon Brief documents the top climate papers that get the most attention every year. And I went back and looked at this and looked at the top 50 climate change papers that received the most online attention over the past 5 years, and found that 64% were from Science and Nature and their subjournals, and 86% would be from what we would consider high-impact journals. So when we include PNAS and The Lancet in the total. So it's pretty clear that if you want your research to get a lot of attention, which journals you should be aiming at. And there's a good reason for this, and that is because These journals have direct lines to journalists. They create press releases for you. They give them to the journalists a week ahead of time. They allow the journalists to then write their papers, and then there's an embargo lifted, and the paper is published at the same time of the stories, and it's all this very sophisticated kind of PR apparatus. And so I saw this with my paper in Nature, that this headline, "Climate Change Boosts Risks of Explosive Wildfire Growth in California by 25%, that was picked up by many, many media outlets because of the infrastructure that Nature had in place to disseminate that research. And there's, a reason they do this, that this validates their status as being high impact. And it's part of their business model. This justifies exorbitant subscription fees that they charge to universities, and publication charges. So these publication charges are extremely high for Nature and Science. It costs $870 per figure to publish in Nature. So with 4 figures, that's about $3,500 to publish your paper. And then if you want to drop the paywall, then it's about $12,000 that you pay to the journal for them to publish it. But despite these large fees, it's still worth it to a lot of researchers because of the attention that it generates and because of the prestige. And it's not just because the research will get in front of the general public, which might be good if you want, a TED Talk or something like that, but it also gets the research in front of other researchers who are then more likely to cite it. And citations, more than raw paper counts, are the main way that researchers are evaluated. And so I've seen this with my previous Nature paper. That paper has more than 4 times the citations of my next most cited paper because of the sophisticated dissemination of the research through the press office. So that's publishing in these venues indirectly affecting your career, but there's also direct influences. So we see this talked about in the pages of Nature, that hiring committees absolutely look at whether or not you've published in these high impact journals as a way to evaluate you. So this is showing that a survey found that applicants were about 6 times more likely to get a faculty position if they had published in a high impact journal. And other research has shown that review, promotion, and tenure committees do use journal impact factor in their evaluations of, when they're going to promote someone or give them tenure. And other research has corroborated this here. Most agree RTP, that's review, promotion, and tenure, requirements should encourage peer-reviewed works of high quality, but in practice, the value of publication is often assessed using shortcuts such as the prestige of the publication venue rather than on the quality and rigor of peer review of each individual item. And I can speak to this directly from my experience, that I've been on a couple faculty hiring committees. And what happens is you have your normal workload and you're given a package of 1,000 pages that represents the applications from these candidates. And you're expected to evaluate that in a week or 2, again, on top of your normal workload. And so you have to scan that. And it's just going to be the case that people are going to look at, oh, look, a Nature paper, a Science paper, that's going to help you out. So this means that the journals can be highly selective in what they publish. So Nature publishes only about 8% of submissions, and Science publishes about 6% of submissions, which also means that placing your research there is highly competitive. And it means that, and this is the direction directly from Nature, it means that when you submit your paper, you want to submit it with a cover letter that actually sells your research to the journal. And you're trying to sell that it's high enough impact for the journal. But of course, the selling of the research is not actually just going to start at the time of submission. It's going to start at the very inception of the research. So back when you're thinking about the research question to ask in the first place. So when considering what research question to ask, how should you think about maximizing your chance of publication? So one strategy you could take would be to align your research question with the high-level messaging espoused by the leadership of the journals. So here is an example of high-level messaging espoused by the leadership of the journals. This is an editorial published in Science by editor-in-chief of Science at the time, Marcia McNutt, called the Beyond 2 Degree Inferno, which is an explicit endorsement of the Paris Agreement 2-degree temperature target at the time. It has a bunch of kind of religious and apocalyptic language in it, describes different levels of human behavior as being sinners or not. She concludes with, "I wonder where in the 9 circles Dante would place all of us who are borrowing against this earth in the name of economic growth, accumulating an environmental debt by burning fossil fuels." So this is an explicit endorsement of a political goal of a rate of decarbonization. And does this suggest that science might be more sympathetic to some research and some research conclusions than others? I think that it does. Similarly, Nature has espoused certain messaging that might give researchers some hints on how to maximize publication. They explicitly endorsed Joe Biden for US president for, among other reasons, climate change policy reasons. So on climate change, Biden would return the United States to the Paris Agreement and is proposing the most ambitious domestic climate policies ever advocated by nominees from the country's major parties. So this suggests that maybe Nature might be more sympathetic to some research conclusions than others. And after Nature published that endorsement of Joe Biden, they got some pushback, but here is the current editor-in-chief of Science, Holden Thorpe, defending the idea that Nature and Science should endorse politicians and policies. He's defending Nature's decision, and he says that if you do not endorse all the way to the level of policies and politicians, this gives people the permission to say things like, climate change may be real, but I don't think we should have government regulation to deal with it, which is unacceptable. We can't concede that by letting people pick and choose. Good for Magdalena Skipper for speaking out. So he's basically saying the authority of science can subsume all of the climate change issue all the way through to exactly, what should be done at the political level. And whether or not you agree with sentiments like that, it's clear that science and nature are explicitly endorsing policies and politicians. But so one question that I think will be in a lot of people's minds right now aren't these statements just emanating directly from the science? So then if that was the case, then it would be fine for scientific journals to just explicitly endorse these political statements. So I want to talk a little bit about the interaction between science and this mainstream narrative of support for the Paris Agreement. So it is actually a widespread misunderstanding that the 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius global warming limits were first established by climate science and then subsequently incorporated into policies like the Paris Agreement. And that has been at least kind of indirectly admitted within the pages of Nature, Nature Geoscience here, a scientific critique of the 2-degree climate change target, where they say this 2-degree warming target is perceived by the public as a universally accepted goal identified by scientists as a safe limit that avoids dangerous climate change. This perception is incorrect. No scientific assessment has clearly justified or defended the 2C target as a safe level of warming. And indeed, this is not a problem that science alone can address. So these authors are coming at this from the perspective, this was back in 2015 before the 1.5 target became much more fashionable. These authors are coming at this from the perspective of 2 degrees is too high and so it should probably be lower. But the important point that I want to emphasize here is these two, that no scientific assessment has clearly justified any temperature target, and this is not a problem that science alone can address. So I think the timeline context is important here as well. So this is the chronology of how these temperature targets came about. So the 2-degree limit was first proposed way back in 1977 by William Nordhaus in this paper in 1977 called Economic Growth and Climate, the Carbon Dioxide Problem. And it was proposed as being probably safe and economically/politically feasible, mostly because that was just estimated to be the maximum experienced temperature over the past 100,000 years. And then over the subsequent decades, it kind of just became conventional wisdom that 2 degrees Celsius was an amount of warming that should be avoided. During this time frame in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change adopted an official objective of stabilizing global temperature at that time an undefined level that would avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. By 2009, there was pressure to define what dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system was, and 2 degrees Celsius was adopted. In 2015, 2 degrees Celsius was adopted as the official goal to limit global warming to in the Paris Accord, with ambitions for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And only after the Paris Agreement came the 2018 IPCC report on impacts and energy systems of 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius. And despite widespread reporting to the contrary, this report did not say that global warming becomes catastrophic at 1.5 degrees Celsius, and it certainly didn't claim to have done some exhaustive cost-benefit analysis to define the rate of decarbonization necessary for 1.5 degrees Celsius to be the optimal rate of decarbonization. But the important point I'm getting at here with the interaction between the science and the mainstream narrative is that climate impact science emerged in this environment where the political goals had basically already been established. And so my claim is that it's always been easier to conduct research basically in support of the existing political goals kind of running in the background than it has been to conduct research that undermines those political goals. And so I have encountered this kind of directly when I encountered this paper in 2018 called Large Potential Reduction in Economic Damages Under UN Mitigation Targets. So this is, again, a paper that's explicitly in the title kind of in support of these temperature targets. They say, our results therefore suggest that achieving the 1.5 target is likely to reduce aggregate damages and lessen global inequality, and that failing to meet the 2-degree target is likely to increase economic damages substantially. And this was covered with pretty generous headlines like limiting temperature increase to 1.5 Celsius could result in 30 trillion of savings for global economy. And so you might be surprised to learn from this headline and maybe from this title that this is not actually a cost-benefit analysis. This is only a benefit analysis. And you kind of have to know the jargon of this literature to know that economic damages refers only to the climate damage side of things and not the abatement costs or mitigation costs or the costs of transitioning from fossil fuels to alternative energy. So a fair literature would also allow the reciprocal type paper to get through framed in the same way. So Nature has published cost-only analyses before, but they're not framed in nearly the same way. So a cost-only analysis that was framed where the title was Large Potential Damages to World Economy Under UN Mitigation Targets, would that be possible to get through? I would venture to say no. And not because it's factually wrong, but because it's too transgressive to the mainstream narrative. So I knew that that wouldn't get through, but I was still surprised that the benefit-only analysis got through. And I thought Nature might be interested in a net cost-benefit analysis, taking these damages that were from this paper and weighing them against the mitigation costs known to exist. So I submitted a paper called Net Economic Impact of UN Global Warming Mitigation Targets that did this cost-benefit analysis. And in our paper, we found that limiting global warming to 1.5 C resulted in a net loss of gross world product relative to 2 C, and even a net loss relative to a no mitigation scenario this century. And that paper was desk rejected by Nature, meaning that it didn't even go to the peer review stage. And we got some general explanation basically saying, you know, this is not of sufficient interest to the readers of Nature. But I find that to be kind of implausible because this is kind of the most interesting type of result in all of climate science, whether the cost-benefit analysis of the predominant policy pencils out. And so I don't think that that's really a plausible explanation. I think a much more plausible explanation is that the results of the study, rather than the topic of the study, were unwelcome. And by the way, this paper was eventually published in PLOS 1 under a longer title, but all of those findings did survive peer review and are in the literature. So this practice of kind of only focusing on the side of the ledger that supports more rapid decarbonization or supports the Paris Agreement is pretty common. So here's another example from a Nature climate change paper, the burden of heat-related mortality attributable to recent human-induced climate change, which just looks at the heat side of the equation and concludes with our findings support the urgent need for more ambitious mitigation and adaptation strategies to minimize the public health impacts of climate change. But of course, cold deaths are part of the picture as well, and cold deaths actually outnumber heat deaths globally by about 9-to-1. So you could have a paper that focused exclusively on cold deaths. And you could then write in your abstract something like, our findings throw into question some of the benefits of the most stringent climate policies as they might slow the reduction in cold deaths. But do we really think that it's possible for a sentence like this to conclude an abstract in a Nature or Science paper? I really don't think so. And so this is all going to this part here about the research question to ask, that there's going to be more researchers focused on the negative impact side of things than any type of positive impact from climate change. So another thing that you'll see is kind of neutral or positive news framed in kind of the worst possible light. So this is an example from Nature Food. Climate impacts on global agriculture emerge earlier in new generation of climate crop models. So this is, kind of framed negatively because impacts has a negative connotation. So you might be surprised to kind of look at the actual results of the paper and find that it's pretty equivocal, actually, what the results are. So they show that warming and increased CO2 increases wheat yields, it increases rice yields, it's pretty neutral on soybean yields, and it decreases maize yields or corn yields. So the study could have focused on positive aspects, like it could have focused on the increased wheat yields, but the take-home message from the study is these results suggest that major breadbasket regions will face distinct anthropogenic climate risks sooner than previously anticipated. So that is these decisions here are the focus of the title of the research paper and of the abstract. So I've documented these types of patterns more systematically in a document that there's a link to in this video that is basically just the 50 climate change related papers from Science and Nature over the past 5 years from Google Scholar, so ranked from Google Scholar's algorithm that is mostly based on citations. So the one that comes up first is pretty emblematic, actually. The human imperative of stabilizing global climate change at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So again, a paper is framed explicitly in the context of this temperature limit, and it is, just an assemblage of evidence in support of this limit. There's not, when you read the paper, there's not really a pretense of like they were open to the costs and benefits of all sorts of levels of decarbonization. It's much more along the lines of here is all the evidence that supports this rapid rate of decarbonization that would result in 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And we see this type of thing kind of again and again. So here's one: exceeding 1.5 Celsius global warming could trigger multiple climate tipping points. Our assessment provides strong scientific evidence for urgent action to mitigate climate change. We show that even the Paris Agreement goal of limiting warming to well below 2°C and preferably 1.5°C is not safe. Here's just a couple more examples. High impact marine heat waves attributable to human-induced global warming concludes with, thus ambitious climate targets are indispensable to reduce the risks of substantial marine heat wave impacts. A couple more from Nature Climate Change, this global terrestrial water storage and drought severity under climate change. Our findings highlight the importance of climate change mitigation to avoid adverse terrestrial water storage impacts and increased droughts, and the need for improved water resource management and adaptation. And finally, over half of known human pathogenic diseases can be aggravated by climate change. The human pathogenic disease and transmission pathways aggravated by climate hazards are too numerous for comprehensive societal adaptations. That was not actually studied in this study. Highlighting the urgent need to work at the source of the problem, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So the point here is just that it's always been easier to conduct research in support of the political goals than research that undermines them. And I'm not even claiming that there's anything wrong with any of these papers, but I'm saying that the focus, the choice that the researchers make to focus on a negative impact and then kind of say that the solution is greenhouse gas emissions, that is a choice that's affected by the culture and by social feedbacks that the researchers are embedded in. And we can see, some of this literature is quite activist in nature. So this is a paper that kind of exemplifies that, harnessing the potential of nature-based solutions for mitigating and adapting to climate change, that ends with this passage. Achieving net zero carbon emissions and transitioning to a nature-positive economy will require systemic change in the way we behave as societies, shifting to dominant worldviews that are based on valuing quality of life and human well-being rather than material wealth, and connection with nature rather than its conquest. Signals such as the rise of climate and nature grassroots activism indicate that this shift is taking place. So writing things that denigrate material wealth and are kind of rooting for grassroots activism, that shows a lot of values are coming through in the literature, a lot of human preferences and human values, and it's not just a kind of just the facts type of literature. So overall, the vast majority of papers in this database support the mainstream narrative. So I would say about 75% are on a topic that either explicitly or implicitly motivates more rapid greenhouse gas emissions. About half use kind of an ominous or attention-grabbing or headline-style title. About half use pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging rather than kind of a more neutral scientific tone. Now, vanishingly few, I'd say less than 10%, adopt an optimistic tone, like leaning into either historical increases in human resilience to climate that we've seen empirically, or leaning into adaptive capacity of ecosystems, for example. And this is very important. No studies use pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging around overly stringent energy restrictions. So there's nothing that's kind of worried about decarbonizing too quickly. And I'm saying that that is part of this social feedback loop. And it's not just that there's no evidence that any harm could be done by decarbonizing too quickly. Something else that's interesting about these papers is very few are truly falsifiable hypothesis tests, like the kind of double-blind randomized control experiments that you might see in medicine. Now, there's a good reason for that. That's because we don't have a copy of the Earth to do experiments on. But this is important to note, this constraint in climate science, because the authority of science largely comes from hypothesis tests that are truly falsifiable. And that's what makes science immune to criticism. Is if you're doing that, you just say, hey, like, you don't believe me, you go test it. Anyone can go test this hypothesis and it comes out the same way no matter what. But that is not really what we see in this literature. What we see in this literature is more persuasive arguments supported by quantitative analysis. And that's a fine method for knowledge generation under the constraints of climate science, but it does not deserve the same authority as truly falsifiable hypothesis test type science. The other thing about these quantitative analyses is a lot of them are kind of advertised in the paper itself as being novel or specifically developed for that study. And that actually should raise some red flags, because even if there's no intentional screening of methodologies to get desired results, which I think is probably unlikely, there would still be a major survivorship bias where kind of only the research groups that happen to use certain methodologies that resulted in compelling answers would survive this gauntlet of obstacles put in your way to get to a Nature or Science paper. So that is this middle column here, the specifics of how to answer the question. There's all these researcher degrees of freedom in terms of methodologies, data sets, models, locations, timeframes that people can either explicitly filter through, or a lot of times I'm sure it's subconscious that people are changing methodologies and they get an answer that they like and they justify post hoc that, well, this previous methodology that didn't give me the answer that I like, that was wrong because of this, it didn't use this new satellite data set, etc. Now, there are also exceptions, so papers that do not support the mainstream narrative. But when those get through, sometimes you are still inviting a lot of trouble your way as a researcher. And an example of that would be this paper, The Global Tree Restoration Potential, that had this line: this highlights global tree restoration as one of the most effective carbon drawdown solutions to date. So this paper is interesting because it got the 4th most attention in the past 5 years according to the Altmetric database, but it's not actually in Google Scholar's top 50 according to their algorithm. And that's because the attention that it got was mostly negative. So here's an op-ed summarizing the criticism. This is called "Exaggerating How Much Carbon Dioxide Can Be Absorbed by Tree Planting Risks Deterring Crucial Climate Action." So these are other researchers. They say, our research suggests that the promises implied in such studies like this actually set back meaningful action on climate change. This is because of what we call mitigation deterrence. Promises of cheap and easy CO2 removal in future make it less likely that time and money will be invested in reducing emissions now. They go on, why would anyone expect governments or the finance sector to invest in renewable energy or mass transit like high-speed rail at costs of tens of hundreds of dollars a ton if they and shareholders and voters are told that huge amounts of CO2 can be absorbed from the atmosphere for a few dollars a ton by planting trees? So they are angry at this research because it undermines the case for the fastest, greenhouse gas emissions reduction policies. So it undermines essentially the Paris Agreement goals. And so science responded to all of this criticism by allowing 3 technical comments to be appended to the paper, and an erratum was issued where they said, in the original version of the report, the author stated in the abstract and in the main text that tree restoration is the most effective solution to climate change to date. This was incorrect. They meant that they know of no other current carbon drawdown solution that is quantitatively as large in terms of carbon capture. They did not mean that tree restoration is more important than reducing greenhouse gas emissions or should replace it. So this had to be appended on to make sure that the paper was much more in line with the mainstream narrative with support of the Paris Agreement. So overall, this focus on kind of supporting the Paris Agreement causes things to be left out. So this literature, has this tendency to focus narrowly on negative impacts of climate change, which are a current side effect of our systems of energy and agriculture. And they don't tend to then focus on a more holistic assessment of the costs and benefits of all systems and their alternatives. And so this has really sidelined the empirical finding that almost all climate-sensitive aspects of global human society have been trending in positive or good directions over the past 50 years, despite 1 degree Celsius of warming. So in the categories of food, water, shelter, disease, these tend to be going in good directions. So for food, yields are up for all major crops since the 1960s. That has translated into less hunger, so per capita kilocalorie per day is up on all continents over that time frame. That means less death from malnutrition, down in all regions since the 1980s. In the category of water, more and more people have access to safely managed drinking water. We're seeing reduction in a lot of climate-sensitive diseases like malaria. It used to be much more prevalent geographically a century ago than it is today. We see reduced deaths from extreme temperatures driven largely by a reduction in cold deaths. But even when you isolate for heat deaths, in most countries, heat mortality has been declining because things like access to air conditioning has outweighed changes in temperature in terms of their impact on human health. We see death rates from all natural disasters decreasing over the past century, and we see economic indicators like the share of population living in extreme poverty decreasing. And what climate science really needs to grapple with is that all of these positive trends have been undergirded by vast increase in energy use, which has been, historically at least, fueled by fossil fuel industrialization. And what I'm saying is that this side of the story is left out in the scientific literature. Leaving this out is particularly important when we think about the inequality that exists across the world today. So this is very stark when you just look at pictures of low energy consumption, low income countries versus high energy consumption, high income countries. It's pretty obvious which societies are going to be more resilient to the climate. And so 3 billion people today still live in extreme energy poverty. And it needs to be a priority to bring them out of energy poverty. And we see the consequences of this energy poverty in the literature. So this paper, Understanding Human Vulnerability to Climate Change, a Global Perspective on Index Validation for Adaptation Planning, highlights that hazard mortality, so floods, droughts, and storms, are 15 times higher. You're 15 times more likely to die from a weather or climate extreme event in a low energy, low income country than in a high energy income country. And so even in high energy, high income countries, energy insecurity is a big deal. So in 2020, this is a report from the Center on Global Energy Policy. In 2020, about 25 million people in the United States reduced or went without food or medicine to pay for energy costs. So the point I'm trying to make here is that energy is crucial for human well-being, and humanity still requires much more energy. But adherence to rapid decarbonization in line with the Paris Agreement and in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius requires a strong restriction on the energy sources, so fossil fuels, that have historically had the best track record of being effective. And my point is that that is not really acknowledged, and that's left out of the literature. Remember, going back to my summary slide, no studies use pessimistic or warning-oriented messaging around overly stringent energy restrictions. So going back to the graphic I showed before, remember there is a scientific consensus that CO2 emissions must be reduced to net zero to halt warming, but there's not a scientific consensus on the optimal speed of decarbonization, like the speed that would be required to meet the 1.5 degree temperature target. And that is in fact an incredibly rapid speed. So if you look here, this is the reduction from the COVID lockdowns and associated economic downturn with COVID. And that was about a 5% reduction in emissions. And we're talking about the same type of 5% reduction in emissions year after year after year, all the way through to the end of the century where emissions go negative. Put in terms of power plants, it's equivalent to taking about 240 coal-powered power plants offline every single year between now and 2030. Put in terms of the cost to the global economy, it's about 7% of world GDP per year, every single year, going towards decarbonization. So it's a very big ask. And what I'm saying is that there's just very little literature that focuses on the possibility of this being too steep of an emissions reduction pathway. And my argument is that that's not because there's no evidence for that. It's because that's not what people focus on because of social forces and career incentives that cause climate science to look much more closely at the side of the ledger that supports this rapid decarbonization than the side of the ledger that does not. Okay, so a bit more then on that social feedback loop. So researchers wanting to publish in Nature and Science and thinking about how to customize their research to do so, just to summarize, they should have a clear sense that some paths to that are more direct than others. So they can inform those decisions by listening directly to the leadership of the journals, reading the journals consistently, observing what happens to papers that go against the mainstream narrative after publication, or observing what happens to researchers who essentially step out of line. So this is something that I experienced, in rapid succession. Between the publication of my Nature paper and the publication of my critique of my Nature paper, that after I published my Nature paper, I got a lot of attention online. I was kind of showered with congratulations from my colleagues. I did over a dozen very friendly media interviews. It's this very pleasant, positive experience. You're treated as this very interesting person with a lot of important things to say. I even received a solicitation to have my paper printed on a mug as a kind of trophy. Congratulations on your newly published paper in Nature. Climate warming increases extreme daily wildfire growth risk in California. So this is all, a prize, an accomplishment for a researcher, a very positive experience. But that all radically changed when I published my critique of the scientific publishing landscape. So there was a lot of high-profile negative reaction on various blogs and websites. Patrick Brown's recycled hallucination of climate science. Patrick Brown's stunt takes climate change denial to a new plateau. A bunch of quotes in here from scientists who are pouring cold water on my claims of journal bias. So here, and especially on Twitter, there was a lot of condemnation and really ostracization of me kind of from the climate science community. But what I find very interesting is that was all going on, publicly, but privately, I received a great deal of support. So this is just a smattering of some of the sentiments I got in my inbox from researchers and academics that I don't know, but still felt compelled to reach out to me. It takes a lot of guts to do what you did. You're advancing science. Thank you. First and most emphatically, I wish to congratulate you on your bravery and strength. I have not in my lifetime in academia seen anyone braver or stronger. Well done. Thank you so much for having the temerity, in the most positive sense, to challenge the prevailing narrative of climate change causes everything, pervading journals such as Nature. I'm so pleased that I've been retired for several years and am not directly exposed to this BS. Keep up your good work. Eventually sanity will prevail. Well done for taking a courageous stand to defend the standards of research integrity. Working in academia, I know the truth you speak. This reporting bias prevents us from moving forward with mitigating measures that could have a meaningful impact while we work on the broader issues. It can be extremely hard doing the right thing, and I want you to know that you can take pride in having the bravery to do it. So I received many more messages like this, and I also received support in face-to-face interaction. So we have this dichotomy of private support and public condemnation, which indicates that the people expressing private support are reluctant to do so publicly because they don't want to be condemned publicly. So this means that there is, self-censorship going on, and this is part of the social feedback loop that puts blinders on climate science. Many of my colleagues will look on and kind of see the way that I was treated and say, you know what, it's just not worth it. Why rock the boat too much? Even something as subtle as like, I don't want to be in awkward faculty meetings can have an impact on the aggregate output of entire fields. And I'll note that this phenomena has recently gotten some attention because of this paper published in PNAS, Pro-Social Motives Underlie Scientific Censorship by Scientists, a Perspective and Research Agenda, where they define scientific censorship as actions aimed at obstructing particular scientific ideas from reaching an audience for reasons other than low scientific quality. So that's exactly the type of thing that I'm talking about here. And the word censorship can sound kind of dramatic, but they make this distinction between types of censorship. So we often think of hard censorship, so authorities like governments using their power to deliberately suppress information. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about this soft form of censorship. So formal or informal social punishments, often by journals or publishers, by individuals, so peer scholars, or a lot of times by the researchers themselves, scholars choosing not to pursue or disseminate their own controversial ideas for benevolent reasons. And they have some nice nuggets in here. So talking about the types of phenomena I'm talking about. Peer reviewers evaluate research more favorably when findings support their prior beliefs, theoretical orientations, and political views. And I like this sentence as an encapsulation of what I'm talking about. So confirmation bias and other forms of motivated cognition can fuel a self-reinforcing dynamic in which censorship and self-censorship discourage empirical challenges to prevailing conclusions, encouraging a false consensus that further discourages dissent. And they have a diagram for the way that this can manifest in the literature, where they're talking about systemic censorship and thus systemic misunderstandings could emerge if a majority of scientists share particular preferences or prejudices that influence their scientific evaluations. So here they have the full universe of evidence where they just have a hypothetical finding where green stars are evidence that some claim X is true, and red stars are evidence that X is not true. And so in the whole universe, they have more red stars than green stars, indicating that X is not true. But this circle represents what's published in the peer-reviewed literature, so it's a 5-to-1 ratio of X is true versus X is not true. And this can come about due to these censorship issues. Okay, so how do we make more room for the full truth and make it so that the literature more accurately represents the total universe that is out there? So one easy place to start, I think, would be the more widespread adoption of pre-registration of studies. So accepting papers based on research questions and the proposed methodologies rather than the saliency or political utility of results. So this would help reduce what's called the file drawer effect, where only the flashiest results of a certain flavor survive to publication and subsequent promotion by the media. I'll borrow and promote two recommendations from this scientific censorship perspective. One is to publish reviews and editor decisions for rejected manuscripts. So more and more journals are publishing reviews for accepted manuscripts, but because the goal of censorship is to prevent publication, reviews for rejected articles and desk rejection letters could be useful for assessing biases in the publication process. And so this would increase accountability for reviewers and editors and facilitate the study of both scientific decision-making and censorship. Along those lines of studying scientific censorship, the journals should really embrace audits of their own practices. So that's the idea of scholars submitting papers with identical methods but manipulated results to test if one set of findings is rejected more often than another, and to see if journals differ in their biases. So the idea would be to shift journal reputations from being largely based on these impact factors or citations to having at least an additional reputation metric that's essentially based on how unbiased they are. So there could be some score that a journal could be very proud of that indicates that they're very unbiased in their publication practices and do not allow much scientific censorship to go on. A suggestion that I would have for journalists covering climate is to realize that researchers have motivations other than pure objective truth seeking. And so your role as a journalist should not just be to promote and disseminate the research, but to actually act as a journalist and to act as a filter between the researcher and the public and ask, all of the appropriate questions and understand the portion of the topic that the research is not looking at. Now, at the level of journals, I think the leadership of journals can make a big difference. So as we've talked about here, there's been, op-eds directly in support of specific rates of decarbonization and specific policies. And these papers often have special issues on climate change and in particular on negative impacts of climate change. But I think it would make a big difference culturally if there were op-eds from leadership of journals or special issues that explicitly welcomed research that is kind of transgressive to the mainstream narrative. I think what this would do is it would open up more room for the study of successful resilience to climate with the motivation to foster more resilience to climate from a human perspective. And it would make more room for the study of the negative impacts associated with overly restrictive energy policy. I think this would foster a more honest and complete scientific literature that would ultimately be more useful for society, and it would lift some of the blinders that are on climate science and make more room for the full truth. Thank you.